family life in the North Country. It's done a little differently today, because we've had some rather interesting, perhaps involved conversations with people, and it seemed that perhaps their concerns or questions would be of general interest, and one of them is put in this way. The question is, what do I think about the gay and lesbian rights movement? Well, we read a great deal about that these days, and the question and the concern has to do with the word movement, because here's what we have. We have a group of people, perhaps 1 or 2% of the population, who are primarily homosexually oriented. That is, they prefer to have any kind of sexual relations with people of their own gender. Well, those people have always been around. Probably in the main are not organized, but there is a group from within that, highly organized, and what they are trying to do is to remake society. All you have to do is to really look to see, to follow them. Now, these militants don't represent the ordinary person. They are trying to remake society and do away primarily with family laws, family statutes, family routines and rituals. They want people to give special recognition. And that doesn't seem to be appropriate. For example, if we had a group that said all left-handed people are blue-eyed people and brown-eyed people, and some of you perhaps remember in school that you had these little exercises in elementary school about blue-eyed and brown-eyed people. This is a group of people that wants their way of life taught in public schools. And not just public schools, but parochial schools as well. See, as an attempt to break down the barriers. Most of you probably recall what happened in New York City, and it's still going on in New York City public schools. An effort was made by groups like this to get alternative lifestyles presented to children and to rear children with the belief that any kind of lifestyle was equally acceptable to what's generally termed the traditional, that is, where there's a mother and a father and children in an intact home. We've had a lot of controversy about these things in some of the states. Colorado citizens voted it down. Courts have ruled that so far that it has to be determined by judiciary. It's a little puzzling. But the homosexual rights groups, the gay and lesbian rights groups, really don't represent the majority of homosexuals. See, we've always had people. Most of them prefer to stay in the closet, like most of the heterosexuals. Most heterosexuals don't go around flouting and publicly proclaiming what they're doing or how they do something. They prefer the sanctity of the home. They prefer to be quiet about what they do and to go along with their life and let their sexual matters be their own private affair. It's a little puzzling, and we're going to see more and more of them, more and more of the problems, because indeed they have gotten into a political arena, very prominent political positions. Unfortunately, we have a governor, we have a president, both of whom seem to be very easily influenced by this group. And in that context, I mentioned the president. Here's a question that came in, a rather puzzling question at first. It says, do I think President Clinton is a communitarian? Well, if you look up the word communitarian, it means member of a communist group. Simply means doesn't get into the politics. I don't know if he's a member of some political party, but I do think that, yes, he is a communitarian in this sense. He believes that the community prevails, that whatever a group of people decide is good for society, that's what ought to be. And in that sense, yes, he's a communitarian. Now, The problem with a communitarian, and I say it quite honestly and openly, and I think anybody who really follows their political agenda these days and watches what comes along is going to see it, that the communitarians are not based on any kind of moral substance. It's a belief that whatever a group of people decide is best, that's what's best. And it may cut directly across such things, for example, as a Judeo-Christian ethic or a Judeo-Christian moral basis. And we see much evidence of that. It's a situational ethic. The organizations, and it doesn't have to be any formal group, but the organization of people of like minds think that, yes, organized society is best. It avoids chaos. But it does not have a spiritual basis. It doesn't have any particular moral substance to it. And when you have a group that operates that way, you're going to see that it changes quickly, that sometimes it's quite contradictory. And in that sense, I think President Clinton probably is a communitarian. Another one came in. It says recently on Channel 5, somebody watches both cable here, hometown cable, and Channel 5. It says you were interviewed about a prenatal assistance program. Well, what was that really about? Well, about 5 years ago, the legislature of New York passed a prenatal assistance program, which was rather simple, was to give good prenatal care to the unborn child. Obviously prenatal, but it extended care for a year after the birth. Now, it was based on the assumption that if you give good prenatal care, children are going to be born healthier, and if you follow up that for the first year of their life, if they have a good start in life, they're going to be better people, more productive, healthier, and so on. Nobody seemed to really object to that. That seemed to be a pretty good idea. Well, it was a good idea until a certain judge came along and said, but that prenatal care and the 1-year follow-up after birth discriminates against poor women because they can't have an abortion. Now, when I first heard that, I used to work with the criminally insane about 20 years, and some people think it rubbed off on me, but when I first heard that, I thought, that's insane. How can somebody say over here, we're going to take good care of the babies, we're going to make sure they have a healthy start in life, they're going to be born under better circumstances, and we follow through on them for a year to give them the best start so that they in turn will not become part of the mill of the cycle of poverty and disadvantage of all sorts of things. Somebody comes along and says, but if you're really fair, you'll kill some of those children. Now, to me, the logic was just missing. It still is. Unfortunately, because this judge ruled that that law was unconstitutional because it specifically did not include abortion, well, that's being appealed now to the New York Appeals Court, the highest court in New York. And if some of you can educate me, and I'm not sure that's possible. Sometimes I have what seems to be a closed mind, but if you're healthier, dead, if you're dead, you're healthier. I don't get it about children. That escapes me. Well, here's another discussion that came up recently, and about family life literature. I have a lot of it. I have hundreds and hundreds of books on family life. And some of the well-known facts seem to keep showing up in the research. People seem to keep reinventing the wheels, as if this is brand new. For example, somebody recently published material saying step-parents and stepchildren have difficulties. Well, that's been known since the beginning of time. There is evidence, yes. Stepchildren and step-parents typically come from broken homes, don't they? The stepchildren do. There's been something amiss there, either a single-parent home or a broken home previously, and so that gives a bias to start with. But But you know what? Step-parents don't have problems that are unique to the biological parents. They really don't. What biggest problem is most of the time is that two systems are already in operation. The system of the family where the children come from, and then the system that's set up by the step-parenting. And so a conflict of systems. Another well-known fact that keeps being rediscovered lately is that welfare programs seem to foster single parenting and seems to foster broken homes and broken families by way of support systems. When welfare supports people for having unwed children or out-of-wedlock children or whatever, the research evidence is crystal clear. Now, there's research in Canada, in Sweden, of course in the United States, all supporting this. And the wisdom of the early legislative bodies in these United States seem to have been quite well founded. Yes, welfare does promote these things by giving support and encouraging independence. There's another one that comes along and seems to be rather interestingly rediscovered. Fertility rates are going down. Well, anybody who looks beyond just the first impression, fertility rates in the United States have been going down consistently since 1800. A little thing just like that, the charts, the graphs, all the way. This is why it was predicted in 1972 there would be no children born. Or somebody made a straight line prediction on that same kind of graph. Well, we are in a serious problem. From about 1972, we have not been having replacement number of children, ZPG. And it is a concern. But it could have been a concern way back in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and that's part of it. On others, we have women who work out of the home don't have as many children. That was planned. We have men who work in the home as caretakers, as nurturers of children. They don't father as many children. Fathers who work out as a provider role seem to have more children. The mothers who work out seem to have fewer children. We also have a discovery in the literature lately that the mothers who rush back to work after maternity leave seem to establish bonds which are not as strong. They are inclined to be detached from their children. We see people who can't wait to get back to work. We see others who are very reluctant to go back to work and who tend to feel guilty and have pangs of guilt from time to time, perhaps even during the workday. Strange as it may seem, they're probably making better mothers. Those women who don't want to go out to work, who want to stay with their children, who want to be the primary caretakers of their children, they seem to make better mothers. Right along with that, the literature is discovering suddenly that well-known fact that when mothers can't take care of their children, the second best caretakers are probably the grandparents, members of our own family. Foster care is not the best way of caring for children. Daycare center certainly doesn't provide the kind of care, the personal, individualized attention children need. It's well known. It's been well known all along. The grandmothers, the sisters, the siblings, these are the people who probably take care of children better if the mother can't, rather than foster care. Another well-known fact seems to be that sexually abused children are more likely to grow up and also produce social pathology. A cycle of poverty, a cycle of codependence, a cycle of drugs, delinquency. They're much more likely to do that. And another well-known fact, to close out the particular program here, well-known fact that families that practice their own religion, whatever the religious group it is, its representative, they practice that regularly. They tend to be happier, more productive. They have by far fewer divorces. Their children tend to be better behaved, better disciplined, better achieving in academics, and those children grow up to be happier as well in their adult lives. Well-known facts being recently discovered all over again. The deja vu. Yes, well known. Until another time, if you'd like to share your opinion, P.O. Box 519, Shazy, 12921. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton, and this is Family Life in the North Country. Well, to start with, we've had some interesting conversations over and over about the same kind of problem. And one person put it this way, he says, I'm aware that many young couples are not getting married, but are acting like it. Why is that happening? An inquiry came from a puzzled grandmother. Well, we certainly see much of that today, and I wish I had a thorough, definitive, deep answer. I have several partial answers. The simplest answer is because that's what they want to do. Now, that answer doesn't really give much reasoning behind it, does it? We know that all of us are inclined to want to do what we want to do when we want to do it. But as we grow up, we learn to inhibit ourselves and to control ourselves and become social beings, much more than the infant, the little child who wants what he wants when he wants it. So let's go into some partial answers. A partial answer would seem that some of these young people today seem to be so afraid of having an unsuccessful marriage that they don't even want to take the first step. They don't want to risk a divorce. They don't take the first step, but they want to act like they're married. Another partial answer is the welfare system today. I'm sure that everyone knows couples like this one. I have a particular couple in mind, and representing numerous people. No one could know really whom I'm really referring to, as I've seen this in several states. But a single mother entitled to welfare benefits. For example, in Canada, a single mother is considered unemployable, and so she gets extra benefits. And we have basically the same pattern in the U.S. That same mother, if she married the father of the children, would be denied some of the welfare benefits, if not all, if the father's employed. And that might be much less, say, health service available if she were to marry the father. So they elect to stay unmarried, and the mother and the children have Medicaid and perhaps other benefits. The father is not fully responsible, doesn't assume full responsibility, and we see this pattern over and over again. The money entitlements for single, widowed people, it goes all the way up the age scale. It's not limited just to young people. We see the same thing in even Social Security, where benefits perhaps are decreased when people marry, and they're both receiving Social Security. Well, we go back not very far back in history, 1933, when Social Security law was first put into effect. It went into effect actually in practice in 1937, and the intention was not to support people who didn't need it. It was a retirement, basically old age and survivors insurance is what it was called, and it was not made for full retirement. It was not intended to be something where people could receive benefits from both directions. It was made on the basis that there would be a husband and there would be a wife, there would be children. If something happened to the principal wage earner, where in most cases that was the husband and the father, then there would be some old age and survivors insurance. Well, we see that now where the aged, the disabled are being cared for independently because of the welfare system. And since Social Security has become a great deal like welfare, we're seeing some of that. That's a problem. What we see as another partial answer is the stigma attached to being unwed, having children out of wedlock, the OW mother. That stigma has been decreased a great deal. And we see it even popularized in the media, in the movies and movie stars, that sort of thing. That stigma used to be there so that, sure, we've always had illegitimate children. Certainly, we've always had children born out of wedlock. Human nature hasn't changed. It's not likely to change. But there was an attempt, there was an effort to make social rules and conformity in keeping with the best interest of society. And it seems that welfare, the way it is being promoted today, is certainly not being in the best interest of society. Another partial answer is the focus on individual rights and freedoms. We have some young people who've been taught in school that any interference with their individual rights and freedoms is a violation of their rights, so they're going to do what they want to do when they want to do it. Now that's a page right out of the Humanistic Manifesto. Yes, it is being taught in schools, and unfortunately it's a concept that some parents and some religious leaders have caved in on. Just caved in, and what we see all around us is that people are not really relating to the need to have that sort of thing in society not put on equal par with traditional families. See, because so many people say, well, what are you doing, discriminating against the individual? No, we're discriminating against behavior, not the individual. We've always had need to discriminate against behavior. That's why we have laws. That's why we have statutes. That's not something created new. Then we have another reason. We have people who, it seems to be mostly young people, who stress relationships so much that they have to be in a relationship with someone or they don't feel they have an identity. Makes me think of a song that perhaps some of you are old enough to remember. You're nobody until somebody loves you. Well, that's not literally true. It's a fine romantic song. But just think about it. If you're nobody until somebody loves you, then it's a happenstance whether you ever become somebody. Because some of us, for example, old and ugly as I am, I might go through life, and it'd be a chance if anybody ever loved me. Well, fortunately, my chances seem to have improved along the way somewhere or way back when. But our worthiness, our dignity, our value as a human being is not dependent upon a chance relationship of somebody loving us. That would make a whole lot of sense. Yet we see so many young people today who really seem to operate on that basis. That if they're not in a relationship, then they seem to be very uncomfortable. Some of you can recall, for example, when things changed from when people used to date. Young people dated, and they dated several different people. And along in the late 60s and early 70s, it seemed to just become the fashion that all of a sudden people were going steady. 12-year-olds, 13, 14-year-olds. They had to be steadily, continuously in a relationship with one person, rather than learning how to socialize with several. Rather strange. But that was the focus on relationships, and we see people today, even some of the, I certainly see it in the battered women. Being in a relationship is more important than their life sometimes. They'd rather stay in a relationship than get out of the relationship, even though being in a relationship may be hazardous to their health. That's not uncommon in the battered wife syndrome, or the battered husband. Well, these are partial answers. These people who, concubines, who are premarital cohabitation or non-marital cohabitation, it seems today to be about equally promoted between the men and women. That's a little puzzling, isn't it? What we're seeing, the same patterns. And this research is not new. This research goes back 30 years. Evidence, and it's being, research is being renewed, and the findings are consistent. But the people who live together before marriage, when they're compared to people who don't live together before marriage, what's the evidence? Evidence is the relationship typically doesn't improve. When these people who've been living together without being married, then they decide to marry, the relationship typically doesn't improve. It doesn't become deeper. We have evidence that they have lower self-esteem, that they don't like themselves, they don't accept themselves as high as the other group. We have evidence that the men particularly are going to develop much lower opinion of marriage and of women if they have lived with a woman before marriage. And we have the same thing now coming up, that women develop same opinions. These same people, those who live together before marriage and then decide to marry, you would think they would have worked out all their problems. No, they're more likely to divorce than the other people. They're more likely to have more extramarital relationships. You would think they would have worked all that out in advance. You'd also think that these people who lived together before marriage and then decided to marry would have worked out their problems in communications. But they seem to have less effective communications when compared to those couples who marry without living together. Even in sexual relations, you'd think they'd be getting along better, but they don't seem to. And here's a sad part. These children born to these quasi-marriages, these non-marital unions, they're more likely to grow up and do the same thing their parents did. It's logical, isn't it? Most children do that, don't they? They grow up and copy their parents. Well, what happens? We have more non-marital, we have more out of wedlock, we have more single parenting situations. And it compounds the social problems many times. Children reared by single parents, unwed parents, are more likely to become delinquent, sexually active, drug users, smokers, you name it. The evidence is crystal clear. They're more likely to become single parents themselves. Not my opinion, this is research evidence. We ought to have the wherewithal, the guts, if you will, the gumption to look at the facts. Look at the social facts and make some prescriptions. For example, welfare seems to promote it. So we need to look and revise welfare so that it does not promote single parenting. Because single parenting sets up this pattern that's not particularly good for children. We need to have parents who are willing to stick to their values. Making it what kind of problems you had yourself. My wrongdoings when I was younger should not really be the pattern that I would follow. I ought to be able to be smart enough to say, I don't want my wrongdoings to lead to wrongdoings of my children, and so on. We need parents who will stick to their values. Don't allow this sort of thing to happen. I know many parents who talk with me about this sort of thing, where the children come home from college or somewhere and say, hey, Mom, Dad, guess who's going to move in with me? Parents said no. Well, children might get unhappy at first. Most parents cave in because they're afraid the children are going to reject them. Well, in fact, the children have already rejected them when they reject your values. They'll come back more appreciative. Don't worry about that. When they need you, they'll come back. They'll respect you more for standing up to your own values. And hopefully that's part of your values. We need for schools to quit teaching alternative lifestyles as if they were equally valuable and acceptable in society. They're not. They don't promote the same things. We need our church and religious leaders to pull their head out of the sand and quit caving in to what may seem to be popular and teach what's supposed to be. When I say that, most traditional religions teach what has been very well established as wholesome for society. All you have to do is look at it. What these people have been teaching all along seems to be the benefit of society. Another prescription would be for civil authorities. Pull your head out of the sand. Don't cave in on these things. Have the courage to do what's right for the community, according to some basic standard that has been documented and proven over and over again for centuries to be for the benefit of society. And if indeed a mother must work to support a family, try to arrange that work at home. There's good evidence that mothers who work at home have as good an influence on their children, and the children seem to benefit the same as if the mother didn't work out of the home. The mother's working in the home is quite positive. Talking about that, the room where we are right now, it reminds me, most homes used to be the place of industry. That's where people work, that's where they live, that's where they played. This room right here, there's a big fireplace. You think about it, 200 years ago, this room was probably built 200 years ago. And this would be a typical home. People gathered around a fireplace, particularly in the north, because that's where the heat was. And so during the day, they typically clustered next to the heat. Father might be in one corner studying or doing something, finishing up his work. Mother in another corner. Big brother, big sister around. Children playing in the middle of the room. Each was in communication and saw what the others were doing. Industry was at home. The education was at home. The home was a center of education, of arts, of humanities. Children were learning constantly by watching the older people in the family. Not unlike this one teacher's school, the one-room schoolhouse. I attended a one-room schoolhouse, part of my education. I studied it quite at length, and I found that it was a very wholesome atmosphere. If you go to a kindergarten today, what you're going to see is a whole lot like what used to be done in the homes. Maybe the teacher's down on the floor with the kids are playing here, and another group of them over there. That's the way it used to be in the home. Reinventing the wheel, isn't it? Well, those are the prescriptions for today. If you have opinions, let me know. P.O. Box 519, Shazy 12921. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton, and this is Family Life in the North Country. We have a series of questions today, and first one, something that I've been reading about. Since 1994 has been proclaimed the Year of the Family. What does that mean? Well, there are two proclamations on that. One of them you probably have seen and heard is the United Nations declared it the International Year of the Family. And then the Roman Catholic Church declared it the Year of the Family. These are two quite distinctly different approaches. The United Nations is for population control. It's never been noted for really safeguarding family. It's not been noted for safeguarding children. It doesn't try to protect the life of the unborn. Peculiarly, it's that way, whereas the Roman Catholic Church proclamation of the Year of the Family is very specific in terms of trying to promote the family as a domestic church, trying to bring attention to the family as the one essential unit of all societies throughout history. So we may be seeing much more of that sort of thing. The differences, though, are quite sharp. And here's another question that comes in. See what you can do about answering a question like this. Had someone say, as a new step-parent, how should I act? Should I try to be a counselor, a teacher, the cop on the street, a drill sergeant, a friend, or what? How would you answer that? What's your advice for step-parents? Well, My answer is that step-parenting depends on several different factors. Whether or not the other parent, that is, the other biological parent, is present. I'm not talking about the mother or father that's in the marriage with you, but the one who is away from the family. Is that person really away, or is that person present? Because, see, to put it together, it creates some very real problems sometimes. Should the person who's coming in as a step-parent try to take the place of the parent? The answer, no. Should the person who's coming in as a step-parent just be somebody who's providing some kind of support or whatever, discipline? Well, it is a serious question. I think the answer also depends on the ages of the children and the gender. Are these boys or girls? For example, a stepfather can be extremely useful with pre-adolescent boys. Stepmothers have a bad running record in spite of the very best efforts most of them make, in spite of what they try to do. People trying to be the best mothers they know how to be, but with early teenagers and preteen boys, that's a difficult thing for mothers. So, it depends a whole lot on the age and the gender. The best advice is to be friendly. Try to fulfill the need, and if you can find it in your heart, try to be loving. I've met people who say, well, if you're going to marry me, you're going to have to love my children. And that's fine. I've heard people say, well, if you're going to marry me, you're going to have to divorce yourself from your children. Those things are kind of hard to do, aren't they? Those things make it very difficult. I don't think that love can really demand that somebody separate themselves from their children. At the same time, we can't demand or force that somebody love somebody else. We can hope, we can wish that were true, but we can't determine that. Well, here's another question. Interesting, because it came up twice recently about screamers. Can people be screamers and still be loving? Well, the answer, I presume you'd answer the same way, is yes. Some screamers are loving. Some families are screamers and some aren't. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's love or not love. Some families are very quiet, and they don't scream, they don't raise their voice. Other families, they just talk at a pretty high pitch sometimes, and maybe most of the time. But the evidence shows that that's not the difference between loving and not loving. That's more of what people get used to, what people enjoy. I even heard the last few days somebody say, well, if you don't care enough about me to insist on your ways, which that translated meant to holler a little bit or to insist, in effect, scream, you must not care. Well, fortunately that didn't relate to my behavior. I was just listening about this sort of thing in somebody else. Well, here's another question that came in that, let's see how you would do in answering this one. It's more complicated. It says, what would you look for in people who are suicidal? Suicidal. What do you think you'd start looking for? If you suspect somebody is suicidal, see if you can come up with the clues. Let's see it. I've worked with suicides for many years. I've taught suicidology, both graduate and undergraduate courses and that sort of thing, for many, many years. Now, what's the message? What is about the person that gives you any idea that the person is thinking about suicide? Person been talking about going away, not being around. Has the person suffered any recent losses in relationships or disturbances in divorce or jobs or having to move? Has the person been moody and depressed lately? Has the person indicated a change in habits like drinking or drug intake? A lot of drugs doesn't mean it has to be an illegal drug. Is there a change in sleeping patterns? Sometimes people who become depressed, some people who are depressed can't sleep, and others seem to sleep more than ordinary. Has there been a change in giving away possessions? Giving away some favorite articles? Well, how about this one? Has a person stated an intention? Pretty obvious, isn't it? Has the person been hostile and angry, at the same time being disturbed in behavior? If the person has talked about it, has a person talked about something that's really deadly, a lethal factor? And how about how old is the person? People over 65, males, particularly white males, are much more prone to suicide than older women. Age has a lot to do with it. Marital status, divorced, widowed. Married people like to complain about their life sometimes, but they're much safer and, as a group, much happier to be around. Well, how would you score yourself? Did you come up with most of those ideas? There are others, but those are the principal indicators of suicide. Suicide occurs about 12 per 100,000 people per year. That's been running pretty consistently for several decades. Some areas, of course, have a few more than others, and they vary from year to year, but that's a national average. That's about the same population, say, as Clinton and Essex County put together. So, on the average, we could expect just ordinary kinds of things, about 12 per year in these two counties, or perhaps Clinton and Franklin County. We see changes. We're seeing more suicides in young people. We're seeing fewer suicides in older women, more in older men. And we see in the young people, we're seeing suicide so often associated with broken homes, broken families. Kind of sad. And then we hear all this stuff about the right of suicide. And cases like Dr. Death, and he's going to help people. Assisted suicides. Well, fortunately, the medical groups in New York State have said that they're not going to get into that. Well, here's another question. I was with a group of people recently talking about parenting, and this question was hot on their minds. And posing the question says, do you believe in physical punishment? Huh? Do you? My answer is never more than necessary. What does that mean? Well, it may never be necessary. On the other hand, never in anger. And I prefer other methods of discipline. But it depends a lot on the age of a child. Depends a lot on the gender, too. Excuse me, it's a strange sort of thing, isn't it? A lot of people clamor about any physical punishment being damaging. Now, I'm not talking about child abuse. Certainly not. But let's look at the why. Whatever the punishment's supposed to be. Excuse me. If we ask ourselves the question, what is it that we want to convey? Are we trying to teach a child? If we're saying yes to that, then perhaps there's a better way. Are we trying to condition the child, for example, a young child, not to do something dangerous? Then there's an answer for that. Is it a symbolic behavior? Are we wanting to convey a particular message to a child? Are we wanting to hit the child because we are angry ourselves? Or we want to get back at somebody else, or we want to get back at a child? Most child abuse, I'm talking about serious child abuse, excuse me, is related to the discipline being a symbol of something else. It's usually in the form of trying to get the child to give the parent something that the child can't give. And that's love. Excuse me, the love that parent didn't have as a child. That used to be a very clear pattern in child abuse. We hear so much about child abuse these days that it's kind of difficult to keep track of what's the latest in the talk shows and all that sort of thing, but I doubt if human nature has changed very much. I would suspect that those are still the same basic patterns. Well, at this particular point in time, let's say that the clock has run out, and see you again next time. This is Dr. John Middleton. Have a good day.